Hi, I'm Steven.
Hi, I'm Omar, and today we will discuss war and security, which will cover why wars happen, the different types of war, why do states gain from war, how wars are fought, and ideas about justice in war, and how we try to manage global security. So first, why do wars happen? Realists believe that war is inevitable, either because of human nature, according to classical realism, or because of international system forces countries into conflict, according to neorealism, which is also backed by the amount of times war has happened, and for the same reasons.
Liberals argue that strong intuitions, democracy, and economic interdependence can prevent war. Meanwhile, radicals like Marxists say that capitalism leads to expansion and imperialism, which causes war.
Yeah. Constructivists see war as a product of social ideas, not just material forces. It's about how countries perceive each other. For example, the end of the Cold War that happened between the Soviet and American leaders, it changed their ideas. They stopped seeing each other as enemies. That is a great example of constructivism at work.
Next, there are different types of wars. Interstate wars happen between countries, like the Iran and Iraq War in the 1980s and the ongoing Russia and Ukraine War. Intrastate wars happen inside a country, like the Nigerian Civil War, or another example of an interstate war is the Syria-Larkin Civil War. That conflict lasted from 1983 to 2009, where the Tamil Tigers fought against the Syria-Larkin government. We can ask, what is the accomplishment of war? Well, simply, it's a statement to get across. It's kind of like, like trying to see like who's the bigger person in a sense, and it's always some common end goal, whether it's to gain territory, more economic power, or just social power and influence. Like the example of World War II. I mean, look at Germany. They basically said, "Hey, look at me. We're going to take over. This Eastern Europe." And this was always after the effect of World War One, when they basically got put to shame, and so now it's like they try to get their their economic power, more territory, and just more social power and influence. And so all those three reasons fall into the example of what Germany was during World War II.
Yeah, and also the concept of force that was fighting have been changed a lot. Like, for example, in conventional warfare, organized militaries face each other directly, following agreed rules. Think of the battles during the American Revolutionary War, or even the Persian Gulf War of 1990 and till 1991. These are examples of conventional warfare. But on the other side, the unconventional warfare include tactics like asymmetric warfare and guerrilla warfare, where a smaller, weaker group uses surprise tactics against a strong military. For example, during the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong used guerrilla tactics like ambushes, for example, traps, blending in with civilians, which frustrated US forces who were better trained for conventional battle. For example, in Afghanistan, the Taliban used guerrilla tactics like ambushes and roadside bombs against US forces. Also, the US forces against Great Britain and how they were able to fight off a big power like Great Britain during the American Revolution. These are perfect example of asymmetric warfare. Would you like to add something, Stephen, for the US Great Britain War?
Yeah, so it was first kind of always conventional war. I think there's always a middle ground because your definition was, there was a common, like set of rules, but there was really no rules. It was just the US was, afraid and tired of, Great Britain's rule and how they were treated. And so it kind of did start off as like conventional warfare. They fought, each other directly. And it wasn't until they changed up leadership and they changed up leadership within their military group to where they started to implement tactics like guerrilla warfare, because they were a more smaller and weaker military, and so they were not able, to fight the Great Britain on equal grounds. And so doing this, it allowed them to turn the tides of war. It's funny how like the Viet Cong and the Taliban used it against them, and the U.S. were more used it back then against Great Britain. So it's kind of not necessarily funny, but it's like
Ironic.
it's ironic.
Yeah. And then there's terrorism, which targets civilians to spread fear, often carried out by non-state actors. Since the 1990s, terrorist acts have become more lethal. The infrastructure to support terrorism have become more sophisticated, and groups practicing terrorism are more wide-ranging.
Is there war ever justified? Well, according to war theory, there are rules about when it's right to go to war and how to behave once in war. These are just called jus ad bellum and jus in bello. And according to jus in bello, combatants must distinguish between soldiers and civilians should never be intentionally targeted.
Another idea is the responsibility to protect, or what's known as R2P. It says that when a government is harming its own people, the international community has a duty to step in. One modern example is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is known as NATO, intervention in Kosovo in 1999. NATO forces acted to prevent ethnic cleansing, even though the United Nations had not officially approved it. It's still debated whether this war was truly just. Finally, how do we try to keep the world secure? Realists focus on the balance of power and deterrence, like how nuclear weapons kept the United States and Soviet Union away from attacking each other during the Cold War.
Liberals also believe in collective security through organizations like the United Nations and NATO. They also support arms controls agreements like the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Also, another way that they kind of establish ways to prevent war is through forming trade partners with people like for example you can say that the US and China would never really align politically or any thought, but the fact that they're trade partners, it gives them more reason to not attack each other because it's like, hey, we like what they have to offer and they like what we have to offer, so it kind of keeps agreement to not war with each other based off of what they have to offer. And today we also think about cybersecurity. For example, Russian cyber attacks on Ukraine that have shown that security threats aren't just military anymore.
So, in conclusion, wars are caused by different forces, as we see, and it can be fought in different ways and are constantly changing. Understanding these theories help us think critically about conflict and maybe one day find better ways to prevent it. Thank you for watching and thank you, Stephen, for the collaboration.
Yep.
Thank you.